This is lesson 6 in the series of the Synoptic Gospels. Today we are talking about the priority of Mark. Again, like I said before, we touched on it, but now we are going to go deeper in it and look why we think this is a thing we have to do, we have to look for. And the other thing is, of course, remember, we are still working in the series, and that's what you have to do. Just remember, read the whole of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Prepare a sermon, have a meeting, read a book, make a book report, and have a group together to meet and to try to assemble the story of the Synoptic Gospels. Of course, you don't have to do the whole thing, but you have to take one chapter of Mark and then work your way through the other parts in Luke and Matthew. We have 4 things we are looking for. 4 things. When we speak about the Bible, we say the Lord revealed it to us. It's the God of Israel who spoke, and that's revealed. It is inspired by the Holy Spirit, 2 Timothy 3:16, 17. It's authoritative, so it has authority in itself, 1 Corinthians 15, and it's a living. The Word of God is alive and active, sharper than a two-edged sword. That's how we look at the Word of God. That's the Bible. Today we are talking about the Marcan Priority. Marcan Priority means that Mark is prior to Matthew and Luke. It does not mean that Mark is a higher level or a higher standard. It is prior means before. So Marcan Priority means it is written before Matthew and Luke are written. Actually, Matthew and Luke are building upon the work of Mark. Remember, Mark is the interpreter or translator or secretary of Peter. And in that capacity, he has access to a lot of material. So later on, when Matthew, who is himself an eyewitness, is looking to write down the materials which we now call the Gospels, and he is writing his point of view, and he's looking for to gather material for his specific target group, which are the Jewish people. Then he's using Mark. Of course, you can say, why is he doing that? Well, it's easier to work on an existing written basis than to find everything in yourself or around you with the people you know. And of course, Matthew knew Mark. Mark was, like I said, the interpreter of Peter. It's like those two were inseparable. And so Matthew also knew Mark, Matthew knew Peter, and so on. And later on Luke. But the most important thing is that we are looking for Mark and the issue itself, that people are writing down material about the most famous religious leader that ever lived. That is Jesus or Yeshua HaMashiach. Of course, that is Hebrew, and here we are talking about the Greek. So we are talking about Jesus Christ, or Christos. That's the equivalent of Yeshua HaMashiach. we know that a number of the apostles never wrote anything else in the Bible. So here we have materials being gathered together, not by one of the apostles, but by the secretary of one of the apostles. So that is the level is the apostle himself. So you can actually say this is the gospel of Peter. This is not so much the gospel of Mark. Mark is only the one who writes it down. So this is important. All the materials that are being brought together before the things were written down in what we now call the Gospels, all those materials, we can call them the Proto Gospels. That is, before the Gospels were written. And we don't know exactly what, where, when, and how the apostles kept their material together. But what we know is there is a oral tradition, and that oral tradition also has its fallout on written materials. From the first decade, that's the years 40 of the first century, we already have gospel material. So we know that the Gospels were not written, or at least the Proto-Gospel was not written in the 60s. It was written as early as the 40s. Just to think about it, okay, just remember, that is not even a generation, that is less than 10 years later, after the death of Jesus Christ, after the resurrection, after the ascension, after the day of Pentecost. So it was the early church was gathering material, and like they did, I mean, they did the same thing with the Old Testament. You know, remember they had Old Testament materials in the temple, central in Jerusalem, but the church was getting bigger and bigger, and was going, you can almost say, different ways, and they needed extra material which was, you can almost say, close to what the synagogues had with their scrolls. And so they needed to have written material, written proof, not for the first generation, but certainly for the second generation. So we are talking about the first generation would live around the time of Jesus' death. I was around 33 AD, the time we are living in. One generation is up and around 40 years. So before the end of the first generation, which was around the year 70, which is actually coincides with the destruction of the temple. Before that time, that's the time bracket we are talking about, all of the Gospels came into existence. Whoever tells you another story, he is misinformed, and they will use a lot of manuscripts and so on and saying this is. You know, we know, and we can count and we can find out, and so we need to go back to the most original one of the originals, and that original was what you can call Proto-Mark Gospel. Mark wrote material down. I don't know whether he wrote complete sermons down or he was just gathering information about Jesus when he wrote the materials down, when he sat down with Peter and he wrote down the stories. I don't know how he did that. Was it on a scroll? Was it on vellum? Was it on papyrus? Was it on parchment? That's what we don't know, and that is not the important issue. The issue is that someone is bringing material together, and who is the first to do so? Mark. Look at the Gospels. Look at the book of Acts. Who is preaching first? Peter. Who needs translation first? Peter. Who is there? Mark. So we know when you bring things together, you know that this is not only important for us to understand, but it gives us a good grasp about the reality of what the Bible is teaching us. That Bible is written by inspired people. So it's not only Peter was inspired to tell the stories, it was also Jesus, because Jesus was the original source. So you have Jesus as the source, and then you have Peter as a source, and now we have Mark as a source. So it's in a line of sources, and all of them are what we call inspired. They are not just eliminated, but they are inspired directly by God, saying, this is what I want you to write down. Of course, they wrote down much more, many more texts, many more pages. All of them are gone now. And the gospel story itself is still there. So we have written, you can call it memorabilia. I don't know whether that's a good word for it, but okay. And then next to it you have the Proto Gospel, or the Proto Mark, and then the thing, of course, that is the link between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So there is what we call utilization. So you're utilizing the existing materials. Okay, so we have those things. There are a number of theories. We looked into that yesterday. One of the issues that came out of it was what is this specific thing? Why do we think Mark has priority? Let me rephrase that. It's not Mark has priority. Mark is the first one. The first one to write it down. We have 8 arguments, and we have to go through all those arguments. Let me see for the next slide. Arguments. Arguments of length. It's easier and it's much more understandable when you have a small text, a short text, and then being duplicated by someone else, and he is adding material. So when you have Mark as the first one, the second one is adding material to him. So that's the argument of length. Let me give you numbers, and you can find it at page 18 of your manual. Matthew has 1068 verses. Mark has only 661. Luke has 1149. Look at the number of words. Matthew has 18,293 words. Mark has only 11,025, while Luke has 19,376. So it's clear that Mark is the smallest. Then Matthew is adding things to what Mark had said, and then Luke is adding again to the material. That is when you look at it, that's the argument of length. It's easier to add than to omit, delete things. That is strange, because then you have to think, if someone is deleting material, why would the Holy Spirit allow him to delete material that is being inspired in another version, or in another gospel in this case? So I don't think that's the case. What I'm saying is, I think the length, or the shortness, you can say, of Mark gives him priority, and explains that we are going to go on a trip with Mark as the priority. Of course, we can have a whole range of things about the length itself. One of the things is that we do not believe that Mark is an abbreviation or abridgment of another text. I think it's just, like I said before, it's just the opposite. So that puts Mark first. And when Mark is first, by the argument of length, it's more or less like strengthening the idea. Mark is there because of his shortness. Not the man, but the text, of course. The Gospel of Mark is to consider a work in itself. So let me quote, and I'm sorry the quotes are quite extensive, but we need to do so. First, it is rather doubtful that Mark intended to write his Gospel by way of confirming what was found in both Matthew and Luke. There's little evidence in this Gospel that this was an important motive. Rather, if any Gospel writer employed this motive, it was Matthew and not Mark. Secondly, there is much material, an extraordinary rich material, found in both Matthew and Luke that is absent, that is not available in Mark. In particular, the birth narrative, the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, the resurrection appearances. If Mark only produced material found both in Matthew and Luke, why did he omit such important passages which are attested by these two other Gospels? So it is, like I said, the deleting of material would be much more difficult than adding material, because then you have to have divine inspiration of deleting. That's kind of strange thing to say. Number three, it is quite an overstatement to say that Mark only produced material found in the two others. Much of his gospel includes pericopes which are found in only one of the other gospels. So it is not that the idea would be easily formed like this. Mark writes material, Matthew is adding material, and then Luke is adding material to Matthew. That would be the easy way of looking at it. But suddenly you have Mark writes material, Matthew and Luke have similar material which is not found in Mark, but also have material that you find in Mark. For example, you have Luke using material that you find in Mark, but not found in Matthew. And the same thing with Matthew. Matthew has material that you find in Mark, but not in Luke. So there is a whole range of materials available here. So the shortness gives way to, let me say it that way, that is, he is the source, or the first one. So we are working on the argument of Mark's shortness as an argument of being the first one. So I think we established that already. So let's go to the next argument. Like I said, we have 8 of them. Mark has a poorer writing style. So the others are actually having a better style of writing than Mark. The reason can be that Mark works from notes. Notes he gathered together from the sermons and the explanations of Peter. While Matthew and Luke, they have more time. Like Matthew is an eyewitness himself, and Luke has, as we established before, he has 2 years of writing the gospel message. And so what he did was gathering material, and of course he had access to Mark and he had access to Matthew. So we can be sure about it that Luke wrote his material with the other materials already in existence. And that's the logical order you find. Mark, Matthew, Luke. And then of course we can add one other book, that is the book of Acts, which is written after. And that we know for sure because it's in the introduction, it is being said there. But the grammar style is not as good as the book of Luke, as the book of Matthew. So they must have had more time, or maybe Mark was hindered by the fact that he was translating the material. You have a whole range of what we call Aramaic expressions. So the Aramaic language comes through the Greek. There is even incorrect grammar. Has nothing to do with the situation of what happened or what is being said, but what is being said and being translated. So that's what we found. So we have what is called colloquialisms. For example, Mark would use slang words. Slang is like in dialect or dialectic words. One word would be that he is using is mattress. And that's a typical slang word that's being used there. While the parallel in Matthew and Luke changed the word into some form of another word, which is literally acceptable. So even the quotes are not literal, but they are refined by the one who is quoting. And both Matthew and both Matthew and Luke are doing so. So you have this colloquialisms, incorrect grammar, and you have the Aramaic expressions. We don't have to work on it very hard and very long in this specific material, because that is not what we are up to. I'm just telling you that these things are happening. For example, Mark speaks about the Korban in Mark 7:11. It's an expression deleted in Matthew, the parallel text in Matthew. In Mark 7:34, Matthew 15:30, and etc. Okay. In these 7 illustrations, the Aramaic expression is missing in all 5 parallel accounts in Luke, and in at least 5 of the 7 parallel accounts in Matthew. So you have a number of expressions being used by Mark, and when they are translated, when they are reused, when they are refined, then they are refined by the new writers, which is in this case Matthew or Luke. Okay, and then what is called the redundancies. Mark has redundant expressions on several occasions where both Matthew and Luke omit the unnecessary phrases. For example, in Matthew 27, the verse 35, we read that the soldiers divided his garments among them by casting lots. Luke, the parallels this with they cast lots to divide his garments. Mark, on the other hand, adds material easily implied in the others. They divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. So you see that the poor style of writing necessitates Mark to explain more things, but they are not needed to be explained to the people who were listening to Matthew or to Luke. So you see, that's what I'm saying when you have this difference in language, and you have the problem of working with them. So this is the poorer lifestyle. Okay, then you have what we call the reading. When you look at the reading of the material of Mark, you can almost say, because it's of the condensed form, Mark is harder to read. Mark tries to explain with fast paintbrushes to show a picture of Jesus and the disciples, and it's quite direct. It's not in a lot of detailing. Sometimes he does, but most of the time he does not. You can find this in Mark 6 verses 5 and 6, and look at Matthew 13 verses 58. He could not do any mighty work there except, and then you have, he did not do many works there because of their unbelief. So the passage offers no clear indication that Matthew is toned down a phrase in Mark, which might cause offense or suggest difficulties. Remember, when you write down material, you have to think of the people you are writing it down for. So your target audience, it is extremely important to know your target audience well, so that you can actually give material to them in a proper way. Not only that they can understand, but you can fine-tune other material, saying, well, let me say it this way instead of that way, because it's more accessible to them and it's not offensive to them. And that is what both Matthew and Luke actually are doing. Mark 3 verse 5 and Luke 6:10, he looked around at them with anger. He looked around on them all. So you see, the message is the same, but it's one thing is more linked than the other thing. In Matthew 1 verse 12, in Mark 1 verse 12, Matthew 4 verse 1 and Luke 4 verse 1, the Spirit drove him into the desert. That is what Mark says. Jesus was led into the desert by the Spirit. That is what both Matthew and Luke are saying. So you have to understand that this is a little bit of Greek to know. Mark uses a very harsh ek balo, while Matthew and Luke use ayo or an ayo, a much more gentler term to describe the Spirit's role in bringing Jesus to the desert for temptation. That is what you have to look for. And I know, of course, when you don't have enough Greek, or you don't have enough material to prove it, don't use this as an example. But there are other examples, and you can find them on page 20 of the manual. Okay, number 4. Let me repeat the ones we had before. So we have the argument of length, we have the poorer writing, and we have the harder reading, harder. And number 4 is the lack of Matthew-Luke agreement against Mark. Like I said before, you have things in Mark, in Matthew, and in Luke. You have things in Mark and Luke. You have things in Luke, in Matthew, and Mark and Matthew, and you have things, certain sentences, certain stories in both Luke and Matthew. So it's not all the same. It's not one pot together where you scoop out the materials. On the other hand, remember this verbal agreement. It means that they are literally taking over some of the material that's been written before, and that means that you have to find the source. There's also a written agreement between Matthew and Luke, things you do not find in Mark. Written agreement, verbal agreement. Verbal agreement is explicitly saying that there is a written form before a Proto-Luke, a Proto-Matthew. Remember we talked about the N and the L, and that's what gives rise to these theories. Let me say this. Matthew-Luke agreement against Mark are considerably less frequent than any of the other forms of agreement. So when Matthew and Luke are in agreement against Mark, that is the exception. That's what it says here. Why at times Matthew and Mark agree against Luke? Luke diverges from his Markan source, whereas Matthew does not. Why at times Mark and Luke agree against Matthew? Matthew diverges from the Markan source, whereas Luke does not. Why Matthew and Luke seldom agree against Mark? This would require a coincidental change on the part of Matthew and Luke of their Markan source in exactly the same manner. It's like two people saying exactly the same. I know how difficult it is. When somebody asked me to interpret or translate material from our own language to English, or from English to our own language, we, my wife and I, would have a different translation because our vocabulary is different. Mine is much more spoken, hers is much more the written word. So when we translate the same thing, we would have a different result. Then we are not talking about the material or the target group we are looking for. When she talks to women and I talk to men, I talk to men, sorry. Then of course, you not only have a different language, you use different words, you use different examples, because what? Well, your target group is different. So it would be very hard to have us making a translation in the same way. Okay, so we had the lack of Matthew-Luke agreement against Mark. Then we have the lack of Matthew-Luke agreement against Mark. The argument from the order, what has indisputably been considered to be the strongest argument for Marcan priority is the argument from order. Okay, the order is more important than the verbal agreement or disagreement. Of course, you have positively and you have negatively. Positively, when all three Gospels share the same pericope. Of course, no problem there. Matthew and Luke agree in the order of those pericope for a great deal. Negatively, when either Matthew or Luke depart from the order of Mark in the arrangement of the pericope, they never agree against Mark. I will say that again. Okay, so when either Matthew or Luke depart from the order of Mark in the arrangement of the pericope, they never agree against Mark. To put this in another way, in the narratives common to all three, Matthew and Luke agree in sequence only when they agree with Mark. When they both diverge from Mark, they both go in a different direction. So what is the best account for this? Most New Testament scholars have assumed the Mark priority does. So Marcan priority is the important issue here. Again, we have a whole possibility of numbering materials. So So this was the first issue. Then you have on the presupposition, one must wonder why the second gospel, in this case Matthew or Luke, using other diverges in its order from the first so frequently. If Luke used Matthew, for example, why did he break up the Sermon on the Mount, leaving out several pericopes? Further, why did he alter or replace the birth narrative by one less colorful, and indeed one less suited for his purposes? The third argument: this view does not easily explain the large amount of material common to Matthew and Luke, but absent in Mark. But if we once accept Matthew's and Luke's use of a major common source other than Mark to explain this common material, there seems little reason to reject the theory of Marcan priority. Fourth argument: a careful examination of Mark 1 verse 1 to 6 verse 6 and the parallels in Matthew and Luke reveals that the reasons for Luke-Matthew departure from Mark's order are well suited to their various literary purposes, while the supposition that Mark rearranged the material does not fit any easily detected pattern in his gospel. So, to conclude, although it would be too bold to say that Marcan priority is completely demonstrated by the arguments of order, it certainly looks like the most plausible view, once it is kept in mind that historical reconstruction is concerned with probability versus possibility, rather than absolute proof either for or against a position. Marcan priority stands quite secure. Literary agreements. And one of the issues is, of course, the omissions when we look at it. Synoptic Gospels are in agreement in a number of cases very clearly, but in some cases there is omissions, or there are omissions in wording. So it would be very strange to have, when you have these omissions, you would have a literary agreement. Literary agreement means you have the same, but seemingly that's not the case. So that would give us more in the sense that Marcan priority is the good way of looking at it. Number 7, the argument of redaction. Yeah, that is a dangerous one, because you can say redaction was done a week after, a year after, 10 years, 1 century, 5 centuries later. So when you speak about redaction, you have to be very, you are tiptoeing through a minefield. The most important example you find in the book of Mark is the end of Mark. Is Mark, when you look at the very end of the book of Mark, as you all know, we talked about that extensively in another course. The ending of Mark is redaction. It means that Mark ends at chapter 16, verse 8. The verses 9 to 20 are added by a redactor, someone who did redaction. And that is happening not just there, it's happening all over. You can see that in other books. The book of John, the Gospel of John, is certainly not excluded because that's the second largest source of redaction material. Okay, let's look at it. Matthean redactional emphasis compared with Mark and Luke. For example, the son of David. This phrase occurs 11 times in Matthew, 4 in Mark and Luke. So how come you have the same story and have different titles? Sheer numbers do not do justice here, of course. Mark begins his gospel with the phrase, and then you have to compare the materials on their own, and then you see why Matthew is using this specific title more than any others. Well, the reason is quite simple. He wanted to let the people, his target group, the Jews, know that Jesus was the son of David. So the fulfillment motive, Matthew's 10 or 11 introductory formula, this was to fulfill, that's the formula we are talking about, are not duplicated exactly by Mark or Luke. So they are, you can almost say, unique to gospel-wise or synoptic gospel-wise to Matthew. Of course we have it is written, but that's not exactly the same. Okay, and then you have Marcan stylistic feature or features compared to Matthew. For example, the word immediately. Immediately is a distinctive Marcan word. It's occurring 40 times in the book of Mark. And remember, there are only 16 chapters, so that's 3 times a chapter. He's using the same word again and again and again. Every time Matthew has the word, there is parallel in Mark. So further, the alternative spelling of the same word is almost always paralleled in Mark. Of the 18,293 words found in Matthew, 10,901 or half parallel in Mark. Of these 10,901 words, immediately occurs 17 times, but in the 7,392 words in Matthew that do not have the Marcan parallel, it occurs only once. So you see, certain features are important. And then you say, it's most of the time the most difficult ones are the original ones. Another word, for. Mark uses an explanatory gar as an editorial comment 34 times. He uses, in the whole of the book, he uses it 66 times. Matthew, on the other hand, only uses 11 times the word God. So that's 1 out of 6 times, if it's all the same. And editorial comments. But he uses them 123 times in total. Well, it's normal because he's double the size of Mark. So it is you can almost say it's a normal thing, but it's specifically when you talk about the editorial comments. Let me see. 8. Mark has a more primitive theology. There are many lines which one could draw to illustrate Mark's more primitive theology. A particular piece of evidence is the use of Lord. Lord, that's Kyrios in the synoptic Gospels. Mark uses it of Jesus only 6 times. In the triple tradition, Matthew, on the other hand, has it 15 times in the triple tradition. It seems reasonable, simply on the basis of numbers, to understand the greater number of instances in which Jesus is called Kyrios in Matthew, as a secondary development in which his favorite title to the early church is read more and more into the Gospels and the Gospel accounts. When one compares all 3 Gospels in their triple tradition, it is evident now that nowhere does Mark have Lord when either Matthew or Luke has or have another primitive term, such as rabbi, which is teacher. But on several occasions, either Matthew or Luke changes Mark's less colorful term to Lord. Okay, so we have a conclusion. We have 8 reasons to think that Mark has priority over or before. That's the priority we are talking about. So that is what we have when we speak about the priority of Mark. So the Marcan priority has to do with the time, the chronology, not so much about the issue itself, that the text would be more important. That's not what we are talking about.